Ciao and welcome to 15 with Fosca, the podcast where we talk about Italy, all things Italian, and taking the leap to make your dream of building a life for yourself in Italy or in the US a reality. Sometimes it'll just be me responding to your questions or talking about topics that are of interest to Italy lovers in general, but often I will be hosting special guests who will work with me through the intricacies of Italian culture, share their stories, and discuss the challenges and triumphs that have accompanied them on their paths to Italy. Since I'm also your US insider in Italy, we'll be talking about how Italians can best prepare for their academic and cultural journeys to my home country. So thank you for tuning in to Ask Fosca's 15 with Fosca. Cominciamo. Buongiorno mondo. I could not be more thrilled to have Leigh Biddlecome as my guest on today's episode of 15 with Fosca, the podcast. I'll introduce you formally in just a few minutes, Leigh, but I wanted to give those listening some background on our story. The pandemic actually brought us closer together and served both as catalyst and uniting force in our relationship. But let's go back to when we first met, when you studied here in Florence as a Stanford undergrad. You were one of several former students with whom I've stayed in touch over the years, and I'm so grateful for these friendships. Our contact was obviously a bit more frequent and closer because you spent significant amount of times in Europe, so I always had a big notion of where you were geographically and also in terms of your greater path. And then you came back to Italy. I went back and looked at our WhatsApp chats and saw that we reconnected in late October 2021. Stanford and Florence was back in session, and then just about a year ago, our relationship really began to take a turn. We were both at a crossroads and began to talk about our writing, our work, and our lives. Our conversations were always honest and energizing, and we never seemed to find enough time to talk about everything we wanted to discuss. Suddenly, you, a mentee, a former student, became both mentor and teacher to me. Over the course of the past year, you have become an important sounding board for me, and I love the fact that our relationship, which is fueled by creativity, empathy, and deep mutual respect, has grown into a sincere friendship, strengthened by our love for Italy, and grounded in our shared desire to serve as cultural mediators or vehicles of Italian culture. Now for your official bio. Leigh is a translator, writer, and curator based in Italy. She grew up in the American Northeast and Midwest and has called London, Lyon, Montreal, and Naples home. In her curatorial work, she brings interdisciplinary creations, particularly dance, music, and visual arts, into heritage spaces and helps provide cross-cultural translation between artists, cultural institutions, and the public. She is passionate about acting as a linguistic and cultural bridge between Francophone, Italian, and Anglophone performance spheres. She recently completed an EU-funded Master's in Heritage Studies at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, Paris. In her client work, she has consulted for international and education-focused social enterprises and with Californian and European food and wine clients. Published translations include French to English exhibition catalogs and Italian to English commercial work. She's also served as a live Italian-English interpreter. As of January 2023, she is a visiting editor and curator for the UK-based charity think tank Perspectiva. I also want to add one more final thing to Leigh's bio, and then we'll start our Q&A. But she was also recently granted the much-coveted and rarely issued visa for freelance work in Italy. So I hope that you will talk a little bit about with us, since during a recent aperitivo, you suggested that I make all my guests talk about their questura horror story. So since it was your idea, I think we could start with that, and then we'll move right into our Q&A for today. How does that sound?
Thank you, Fosca.
You're welcome.
I'm really excited to get to talk to you in a context that's a little different than our normal conversations, but hopefully with just as much energy. So the questura story, we all have one. Anyone that's come to Italy has a questura story, and anyone who's come and wanted to stay. Mine involved a lot of back and forth. I finally found a woman there that kind of took me under her wing, helped me with the process insofar as she's allowed to as an official. And I flew back to the US in April, just last month, and managed to get this visa, and it's currently being converted into a permesso di soggiorno. So I feel really grateful because it's this freelance visa which allows you to work under basically any Italian company as a contractor. And it just provides a lot of opportunities that otherwise someone coming in without that wouldn't necessarily have access to.
Exactly. And you're like, maybe, I don't know if you said you were the first person ever. She had never seen anyone in Florence present
Yeah.
this request for this sort of visa,
She said she'd had 5 requests in 20 years of working there.
which is absolutely amazing.
But I think it's partially because it's really hard to get all the documents that you need in order to make it go through. It's also because some people don't know how to do it. I think you have to have a certain level of Italian in order to manage the process.
Absolutely.
Or you need someone helping you every
Yeah.
step of the way.
Mhm.
So that was part of it. And also because they only give out 500 a year in the world. So that's why not that many people ask for them.
Okay. So tell me about the work you're doing right now.
Okay, so it's a mix. I have a few days a week that I'm working for this UK-based organization, and I do online events for them. I edit their work that goes online, essays. I'm working a bit in their publishing house side. And then what I'm doing in Italy is making more and more contacts.
Okay. So you're networking.
So I'm networking a bit like you. But recently I've just felt like the last few months has been this kind of blossoming of opportunities. I've met people that have an online magazine here that do work related to sort of discovering Italy's treasures that aren't particularly known. I have met some people that are involved in an arts organization that have turned a church into an art space for performances and for exhibitions, music, and just slowly, I'm making these inroads into the arts and culture community here in Florence. And so I'm hoping to do more work kind of like as a curator, but also bringing in artists from outside Italy here
Wow.
and trying to make a little bit more of this cultural exchange happen, which sometimes gets lost, I think.
Okay. And I guess it's one of my questions for you. It's something we talk about a lot, but how do you see Florence today compared to when you were here as a student,
Mm.
you know, quite a few years ago? Not like that many, sorry.
No,
But
15, that's okay.
okay, so how has the city, do you think the city has changed? Where is it going? What does it feel like now? I think something that some of our listeners might not know is sort of what is going on culturally today in Florence. It's not only the Uffizi and, the David. There's this sort of interesting scene. So would you like to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot, and I feel like we're at this tipping point, and it can go in a good direction. It also has the potential of going in a slightly less positive direction.
Okay.
On the good side, I see a lot of Italians coming back home who are my age, who lived abroad and are bringing back with them this sensibility that is very open and innovative and creative, and they're trying to create something new in the place where they were born and from. So that's really cool. And then I also see a lot of Americans and other Anglos that are coming in that see this as a place of beauty, first and foremost,
Always.
as a place that's really great to raise your kids if you have kids, as a place that has so much around it that's gorgeous that you can go to on the weekend, and a kind of small town sensibility in some way, which means you run into people all the time on the street.
Right.
And that creates a familiarity and a comfort really quickly. So I see that. And then just more specifically, I've just come across so many new little organizations, new artistic communities. And then there's Manifattura Tabacchi, which is the big new development happening. That's what's not a development so much as a refurbishing and repurposing of an old tobacco manufactory.
Right.
So that's happening as well.
Right.
So I see that. At the same time, I feel a little sad because when I came here as a student, there were all these little botteghe, like artisans that were working in this neighborhood where we're recording today. And some of those have disappeared. And so I think the critical thing right now is for Florence to kind of reckon with how can it be a city for people who are really invested in staying here longer and not just for a 2-day weekend, kind of in and out.
Exactly.
So that's where I feel like the opportunity is.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think even the space that we're in right now, which is called the Conventino, is this repurposed former convent where there's a lot of creative energy, a lot of things going on. And I think that's a definite sort of concerted effort to foster this kind of creative community. of both locals and, this immense influx of foreigners coming in, but not for short term, to really to stay here. And so Florence is at this interesting crossroads, as you said. It's at this moment, the tipping point, right? So will the city be able to actually do this? And I'm not sure, but what I see happening is that I do see more of an awareness around it. And so I think that if people recognize the kind of potential that the city has, also, for example, to keep some of those artisanal traditions alive. And so something that I see, and I'd like your opinion on this as well, and then we'll get back to sort of where we are in Florence right now and where we see Florence going. But I guess I'm really interested to hear your read on why, as you said, a lot of your friends who, people your age who are Italians are coming back to Florence to invest in that. But you also mentioned people coming from abroad and saying, yeah, Florence represents beauty and it's a small town and stuff. But why else? Why do you think Florence is so hot right now, especially, for example, for digital nomads or for people who are relocating even with young children? Like, why Florence? Why not Rome? Why not Milan? Or why not? I mean, it's happening obviously in other European countries as well, but why is Florence so hot right now?
I mean, I think it's always captured the imagination of English speaking people, like for the last 200 more years. So I think it's always been kind of like subconsciously there in people's imagination as a place that they would want to maybe live in. And now all of a sudden, if there's a possibility of working remotely, you suddenly have this option. Or maybe I could actually live there. And there's just specifically for Florence, there is more of an infrastructure that caters towards people that are coming from Northern European countries or from the US. There's cafes that have workspaces that you can go to. There's a lot of sort of like public parks and spaces that are like nice to spend time in. And it's fairly clean as a city, I think, like all things considered.
Yeah.
Um, it's a good question, though. I wonder sometimes, like, yeah, why do people come to Florence? Because I didn't come to Florence because I had a desire to come to Florence specifically. I came because my aunt lives here.
Right.
And so it was a place that I needed to land during the pandemic while I was doing my master's remotely in the last year. So I don't know. That's a good question. And I'm not sure. I think it's partly right now this question of like what is going to happen to the people that have arrived and are trying to find their way in the place, and like what is it that those people are going to create that's going to be new or different. I think that's the really interesting question.
And I think one of the keys is if a lot of these young creatives who are coming to Florence, whether they be coming to study at a place like Polimoda or coming to work at a place like Manifattura Tabacchi, I think it's important that if young Italians are not going to pick up sort of the great Italian tradition of, for example, I don't know, whatever it may be, whether it be, I don't know,
Like
gilded or, jewelry making or making straw, the tradition in San Frediano of making straw chairs or, making hats or silk, a lot of silk work, embroidery, things like that. If young Italians no longer want to do that, or, whatever, at least there's this wonderful influx of young creatives coming to study a lot, to, study fashion, but to study those techniques and maybe actually, work side by side with these artisans who are, if they don't find people to keep up the traditions, that's going to they're just traditions that are going to disappear, which would be a real loss, I think, for all of us, right?
Yeah, and I think actually that speaks to this larger question of like how attached do we have to be with the nationality of the person who's doing the art, right? So I think, I mean, I feel really strongly about the fact that these artisan traditions should be open to anyone who wants to come study seriously under a master.
I agree.
And do it.
That's right.
Like the lady I take my shoes to is Japanese, and she has studied how to do beautiful classical Italian designed leather shoes.
Right.
And for me, that's like fantastic that I get to go and chat with this Japanese woman when I get my shoes redone.
And the thing is, I don't understand. It's common, like, for example, thinking the hospitality industry, right? Thinking about cooks or chefs. It's very typical for, a US chef to absolutely come to Europe to learn under a master, right? Even sometimes, just as an intern, if you will. And so if that tradition, if that world is so open, I don't understand why other things shouldn't also have that same sort of openness. And I think, though, Florence is changing. And if I think about how different it was even just a couple of years ago, and you and I have talked about this, and I actually am a firm believer, and I'm certainly not the only one, that Florence is definitely experiencing a second renaissance right now. And if the city and, the city's administration plays its cards right, Florence could really become another. I mean, it already kind of is, but I think it could become one of the most important cultural centers in the world today. I'm not just talking about Europe. There's a lot going on right now.
Yeah, and I was thinking about like some of the friends that I have here. One of them, has Italian heritage, is American, and came with his wife, and he's a painter, and he set up his studio here, and he's working from here, is going to artist residencies across Italy, and is like said, this is our new life. Like we're in Italy now. And I also met a Belgian woman recently who's doing the art restoration school here. I met a Venezuelan woman who's your generation that has also done that restoration school and has stayed. So there's a lot of people that come here for the art and the art training and then decide, actually, this is the place I want to stay. It's not just a place where I'm learn the trade or practice.
Grazie, as always, to our listeners. And thank you again, Leigh, for joining me on 15 with Fosca. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope we'll be able to do this again very soon. Thanks again, everyone. Grazie mille ancora e a presto.